At the gala, his lover splashed red wine on me. She never saw what came next. Hello everyone! I've noticed that many of you watch these videos all the way through, but don't hit subscribe. Subscribing is completely free, and your support gives me the motivation to bring even more powerful stories. So take a second to subscribe and let's get back to the story. The ballroom unfolded like a world set apart from reality, a stage designed not for celebration but for power, where every gilded corner and shimmering light spoke a silent language only the chosen could understand. Chandeliers the size of carriages dripped crystal light across marble floors so polished they reflected faces like water, and violins soared above the hum of voices. A symphony rehearsed for months to sound effortless. The scent of imported orchids and roses lingered in the air, mingling with perfume worth more than salaries, and the sound of laughter bubbled like champagne thin. Elegant but fragile, a mask stretched too tightly over hidden rivalries. Women in gowns stitched with precious stones glided like queens, their jewels winking under the lights, while men in tailored tuxedos wore arrogance like a second skin. I moved among them with a deliberate poise, my gown a waterfall of silver fabric, chosen not only for beauty but for the statement it whispered, I belonged here. Not by chance or accident, but because I had earned the right to be seen. At my side walked a man whose presence ensured whispers, the kind of man whose name alone pulled headlines, whose smile pulled cameras, whose nod pulled alliances together. To walk with him was to step into fire, and I felt every gaze, every measured glance, every quiet murmur of speculation. Yet my mind was not on the glittering stage of politics and wealth. It was on her. Across the ballroom, moving with the deliberate grace of someone who knew every eye was following her, was his lover. She wore scarlet silk that clung to her body as though it had been painted on, her hair gleaming, her lips curved in a smile so dazzling it might have passed for warmth. But her eyes gave her away. They found me like arrows in a crowd, dark and sharp, glinting with something that had nothing to do with admiration. It was envy, it was fear, it was venom wrapped in velvet. I had felt it before, the way her gaze lingered too long, the way her laughter carried too loudly when I was near, the way she positioned herself in conversations to erase my presence, and tonight it was stronger than ever. She circled the room with calculated ease, shaking hands, kissing cheeks, weaving herself into the tapestry of the evening like she belonged at the very center of it, and yet I could feel her circling me, always at the edge of my vision, always a step away. The gala was meant to honor tradition, to raise money for causes paraded as noble, but for her and for me it was a battlefield, and the chandeliers might as well have been floodlights for a duel waiting to begin. My heart drummed steady as I moved from one cluster of guests to another, feigning smiles, exchanging pleasantries, even as my awareness stretched like wire sensing her, anticipating the inevitable moment when she would no longer be able to contain herself. The orchestra shifted into a quieter melody, signaling the approach of the host's speech, and as the crowd drifted toward the grand staircase where he would soon welcome us, I caught sight of her again, standing too close to him, laughing too loudly at something he had said, her hand brushing his sleeve with a familiarity that made the air between us electric. I inhaled, slow and steady, bracing myself because I knew something was coming. She was not a woman who let opportunities slip by, and tonight, with the world watching, she would not waste her chance. The moment shattered with the simplest of actions. So quiet at first it seemed almost accidental. We had gathered near the staircase, the host lifting a hand for silence, the crowd falling into expectant hush. Waiters passed with trays of wine, their movements a practiced ballet, and one glass found its way into her hand. She drifted toward me like a shadow, her gown brushing across the marble, her smile radiant, her eyes lit with fire that only I could read. She leaned in as though to greet me, her posture flawless, her voice sweet with rehearsed charm, and then her wrist tilted, casual, unhurried, as if this were not the culmination of weeks of malice but simply a clumsy accident. The red wine poured down my gown in a rush, staining the silver fabric in a flood of crimson that spread like a wound across my body. The sound of liquid splattering into silence was deafening, followed by gasps that ricocheted around the hall, sharp intakes of breath that seemed to echo against the marble walls. For a single second, time broke. The host froze mid-sentence, the orchestra faltered, and every eye turned toward me. The wine clung heavy, dripping down to the floor where it splashed against my shoes, pooling like blood at my feet. I heard the whispers first, too loud to be ignored, too quiet to answer. Was it an accident? Did she mean it? Look at her face, no. Look at her smile. That smile was the confirmation, the dagger twisting in silence. She covered her lips with her hand as though embarrassed, murmuring a soft "oh," but her eyes betrayed her. Triumph glimmered there, sharp and unrepentant, the look of a woman who believed she had won. She thought she had reduced me to spectacle, the target of pity and scorn, the humiliated outsider drowning in the eyes of a merciless crowd. And yet, as the cold soaked through the silk, as the whispers cut across my skin sharper than any blade, I felt no collapse, no crumbling of the mask I had built. Instead, something inside me crystallized. I stood taller, my back straighter, my chin lifted. I met her gaze and held it, unflinching, and in that moment she faltered, just barely. The flicker of uncertainty darting across her features before she hid it again behind her practiced mask. She had underestimated me. She had thought humiliation would unravel me, that the spectacle of ruin would break my poise, but she was wrong. Beneath the dripping wine and the judging eyes, I felt a resolve take root, colder and sharper than anything I had ever known. I would not flee, I would not wither, I would not grant her the satisfaction of victory. The silence stretched and I let it, knowing that every second of my unbroken composure struck deeper than any protest or denial could. She had played her move, and the crowd believed she had won. But what she could not yet imagine, what she would never expect, was that she had awakened something in me she would come to regret. The gala had turned from spectacle to battlefield, and she, in her arrogance, had fired the first shot. I did not know then exactly what would come next, but I knew this much with absolute clarity. It would not be her triumph they remembered from this night. The silence after the spill stretched longer than any silence I had ever endured, an almost sacred stillness in which every eye fixed on me, some wide with shock, others narrowing with satisfaction, and still others glimmering with hungry curiosity, as though they had been waiting for this moment all along. The ballroom, which only minutes ago had shimmered with practiced laughter and polished elegance, now vibrated with an entirely different energy, sharp, electric, dangerous. The music had cut short, the orchestra fumbling into uneasy silence, and the host stood frozen at the staircase with his glass raised halfway, lips parted, caught in the absurdity of watching the evening's grandeur collapse into chaos because of one calculated spill. My gown clung to me like second skin, heavy with wine, its silver fabric destroyed under the spreading crimson, but I forced myself not to move, not to flinch, not to touch it as though to acknowledge the ruin would hand her victory. I could feel the weight of whispers bouncing around me, words carried like arrows across the room. She did that on purpose. Look at her, she's smiling. How humiliating. Will she cry? Will she leave? I let their questions swirl like storm winds, but I gave them no answer, holding myself steady, chin lifted, eyes locked on the woman who had orchestrated the spectacle. She, of course, played her part to perfection, covering her lips with delicate fingers, gasping softly for show, offering murmurs of apology that rang hollow to anyone who cared to look past her performance. Her scarlet gown glowed even brighter against the ruin she had inflicted, her smile just sharp enough to betray triumph to those close enough to see. She thought she had struck me down in front of hundreds, reduced me to ridicule, yet, in her arrogance, she failed to notice the tremor of unease building in the room, the discomfort of guests who recognized cruelty when it masqueraded as clumsiness. I caught glimpses of faces in the crowd, men frowning into their glasses, women whispering behind gloved hands. Alliances shifting with every second, the silence lingered, and I realized that the power she thought she had, seized, might slip through her fingers if I played this moment correctly. And then the tide broke. A laugh, sharp, careless, too loud, spilled from her lips, betraying her mask, and the ripple it sent through the crowd was unmistakable. This was no accident, no misstep, but an attack staged with venom. The whispers sharpened, some sympathetic toward me, others gleeful at the drama, but all of them certain now that something significant had just been set into motion. I let the silence end on my terms, inhaling slowly, pressing every ounce of composure I had ever cultivated into the air between us, and I smiled, not a wide, forgiving smile, not a nervous smile, but one edged with steel, a smile that told her, and everyone watching, that I was not broken, that I would not be erased so easily. The effect was immediate. She faltered, just a fraction, her eyes narrowing, her hand tightening on the stem of her glass, and the crowd, sensing the shift, leaned forward with collective anticipation. A line had been drawn, invisible yet undeniable, and we both knew that what came next would determine who truly owned this night. By the way, I'm curious. From where are you watching this video? Drop it in the comments. I love seeing the community grow. The host, desperate to regain control, cleared his throat and attempted to resume his speech, but his words stumbled, drowned by the whispers still crackling through the room. My companion reached for my arm, his face taut with concern, perhaps ready to lead me out, but I brushed him off gently, silently reminding him that to retreat now would cement her victory. Instead, I stepped forward, out of the circle of paralysis, letting the ruined gown trail behind me like a flag of defiance, and began to engage with the guests nearest to me. Their eyes widened at my composure, at my audacity to continue as though I had not been targeted in front of them all, and murmurs shifted, softer now, tinged with something like admiration. I offered a word here, a nod there, my voice steady despite the cold fabric clinging to my skin, and with each exchange I rebuilt what she had tried to dismantle. But she was not finished. She drifted closer, her laughter ringing louder, her remarks aimed just sharp enough to pierce me. "So clumsy of me," she purred, brushing at the edge of my sleeve as though to help. "I do hope the fabric wasn't too delicate." But then accidents happen, don't they? Her words carried, deliberate, ensuring that those nearby heard the mockery hidden beneath the veneer of innocence. I met her gaze again, and this time I let my silence sharpen into something colder, something that unsettled even her. For the first time, I saw the faintest flicker of doubt in her eyes. The crowd, too, sensed it. Conversations shifted, alliances whispered, the balance of sympathy tilting toward me as her performance began to unravel under scrutiny. Yet still she pressed on, determined to claw back control, weaving through the crowd to poison ears with whispers I couldn't hear but could imagine, stories of my supposed arrogance, my unworthiness, her victimhood dressed in scarlet silk. The tension thickened with every passing minute until the gala no longer felt like an evening of celebration but a powder keg waiting for a spark. And I knew then that what she had unleashed could not be contained with silence alone. This was not a slight to be endured, it was a declaration of war. I had survived the first strike, but the night was far from over, and as I looked at her across the glittering room, her smile curdling into something brittle, I understood with chilling clarity that my next move would define not just this night, but everything that followed, long before the wine splashed across my gown, long before the gala became a battlefield. There had been signs subtle, persistent reminders that this confrontation was not sudden but inevitable, the slow culmination of years of tangled histories, jealous glances and wounds never allowed to heal. To understand why she tipped that glass, why she chose humiliation as her weapon, one must look further back, to the chain of moments where envy grew roots and resentment flowered. She had always carried herself like someone who deserved the world, and for a long time, perhaps she had reason to believe it. From her first entrance into our circle, she drew attention effortlessly, the bold laughter, the glittering wit, the way she wore scandal like perfume. She thrived on it, fed on it, until it became her identity. But beneath the polished surface lay insecurity, the constant fear that her place was never guaranteed, that she was tolerated rather than truly embraced. And then there was me, the inconvenient presence, the quiet figure who entered not with noise but with steadiness, who didn't seek the spotlight yet somehow threatened her hold on it. Our story began with wary politeness, the kind exchanged between rivals forced to share a stage, but even in those early days I saw the flicker of disdain in her eyes. Whenever I spoke, her smile tightened. Whenever I laughed, her gaze lingered too long, calculating. The first cut came years ago at a smaller gathering, when she whispered a lie into the ear of someone powerful, a rumor meant to tarnish me, to reduce me before I had even begun to rise. I learned then that she fought with whispers, with carefully staged performances, with sabotage disguised as coincidence. Still, I endured, choosing silence over confrontation, believing that time would expose her venom without my intervention. But silence, as I would come to understand, only emboldened her. Each year she pressed further, little slights at dinners, mocking comments disguised as jokes, the calculated exclusion from conversations she dominated. And through it all I remained composed, determined never to stoop to her level, never to show the cracks she so desperately sought. Yet beneath my restraint, the tension coiled tighter, and I began to see that we were not merely two women caught in social rivalry. We were symbols. To her, I was the threat of replacement, the shadow that reminded her how precarious her hold truly was. To me, she was a mirror of everything I refused to become, desperate, manipulative, defined by possession rather than purpose. And it was this clash, silent but unrelenting, that made the wine spill not an accident of temperament but the climax of a war she had been fighting long before the gala began. But her history, our history, did not end with petty jealousies. It reached deeper, into secrets whispered behind closed doors and choices that left scars on both of us. She had been his before me, though not in the way she pretended. Their affair was not built on love, but on convenience, on desire sharpened by rebellion, a performance as much for the crowd as for themselves. For years she clung to that bond, wearing it like a crown, using his presence to legitimize her place in a world she could not conquer on her own. But what she failed to see, or refused to admit, was that he had grown tired of the theatrics, tired of the endless hunger for attention, tired of being used as a ladder. When he turned his gaze toward me, when he began to find in me a steadiness, a quiet strength she could never manufacture, her world tilted. She laughed it off at first, mocking me as plain, unremarkable, unworthy of his attention. Yet as time passed, her laughter sharpened into hostility, her jokes into open jabs, because she saw what she feared most, that he no longer needed her. It was not only about him, though our rivalry expanded into every corner of our shared world. In business, I earned respect she never could. In circles of influence, I carried myself with a dignity she mistook for arrogance. Every success I achieved felt to her like a theft of what she believed was hers by right. And so the bitterness grew. She lashed out in private, spreading stories, planting seeds of doubt, convincing herself that if she could poison others against me, she could maintain her throne. But whispers have limits, and there comes a time when rumor is no longer enough to wound. That was why she chose the gala, because she needed spectacle, a moment so public, so humiliating that it could not be erased. To her, spilling that glass of red wine was not simply an act of malice, it was a declaration, a desperate attempt to reclaim what she had lost, to remind the world that she still had power. Yet what she never understood, what she could never understand, was that true power is not taken with cruelty or held through spectacle. True power, the kind that endures, is quieter, steadier, forged in resilience rather than theatrics. And as the wine soaked into my gown, as the crowd whispered and gasped, as she savored what she thought was victory, I knew her history had already doomed her. Because for all her plotting, for all her venom, for all her desperate clinging to control, she had just revealed herself not as powerful, but as afraid. And nothing, not even the glittering chandeliers above us, could disguise the truth of that fear now that it had been laid bare for everyone to see. And tell me, what kind of story should I cover next? Family drama, revenge, or secrets revealed? Comment your choice below, and maybe your idea will be the next upload. The aftermath of her performance did not fade as quickly as she had hoped, nor as quietly as I might once have allowed. Instead, it lingered like smoke after fire, clinging to every corner of the ballroom, seeping into every conversation until the entire atmosphere shifted from celebration to scrutiny. What had been laughter and polite chatter only minutes earlier had hardened into something brittle and watchful. I could feel it in the way people's eyes slid between her and me, the way they whispered into their glasses of champagne, trying to decide which story to believe. Hers, the charming accident dressed in silk, or mine, the silent refusal to break beneath humiliation. At first I let the tension breathe. I stood tall, still as a statue, letting the ruined gown trail behind me like a banner of defiance. And though the wine had soaked through, though its cold sting clung to my skin, I carried myself with such deliberate calm that even those who pitied me began to reconsider, their pity shifting into respect, their curiosity sharpening into awe. Yet she could not leave it alone. To her, silence was defeat, and my refusal to crumble was intolerable. She moved closer again, weaving through the clusters of guests like a predator circling its prey, her laughter rising too brightly, her remarks pitched just loudly enough to be overheard. "I do hope you forgive me," she cooed at one point, brushing her fingers against my sleeve as though offering comfort, though her nails dug in ever so slightly, enough to remind me that this was no apology but a warning. One can never be too careful with silk, it stains so easily, doesn't it? Her words, coated in honey, dripped poison into the air, and the guests nearest to us stiffened, glancing between us with expressions that betrayed both discomfort and fascination. I met her gaze, steady and unflinching, offering nothing in return, and for a moment her mask cracked, her smile twitching at the edges as though she could not fathom why her performance was failing to draw the blood she craved. That was when the escalation truly began, not with another glass tipped or another insult delivered, but with the crowd itself, restless, hungry, leaning into the tension as though they sensed a storm about to break. Some encouraged her, drawn to drama like moths to flame, whispering encouragements that pushed her further. Others shifted subtly toward me, their eyes sharp with something like expectation, as though waiting to see if I would finally strike back. And through it all I could feel the music faltering, the orchestra playing on but trembling at the edges, their notes stretched thin against the weight of silence pressing in from every corner of the hall. She pressed harder, sensing both danger and opportunity, and with every passing minute her remarks grew bolder, less veiled, her laughter sharper, her attempts to bait me more obvious. At one point she brushed past me deliberately, tilting her head to murmur, "You do wear defiance well. But how much longer can you keep up the act? Eventually they'll all see you for what you are, out of place, out of depth, unworthy of standing where I stand." Her words cut. Not because they were true, but because she wanted them to be, because she had built her entire identity on the belief that she alone belonged at the center. And yet, even as she tried to corner me, I began to notice something shift in the crowd, small frowns directed at her instead of me. Polite smiles that faltered when she approached, glances exchanged that betrayed unease. For the first time that evening, she was losing control of her audience, and the realization only made her more reckless. She raised her glass again, this time not spilling but toasting, her voice cutting through the air as she declared loudly enough for half the ballroom to hear, "To elegance! To grace under pressure! To knowing your place!" Laughter followed hers, brittle and forced, but the room did not join her. Instead, there was an awkward silence, a stiffness that made her eyes flash with anger before she masked it again. And in that silence I realized I no longer needed to defend myself. She was unraveling without my help, each move she made tightening the noose she had placed around her own neck. But the escalation was not hers alone. As the night wore on, as whispers swirled like smoke, I felt the weight of expectation pressing down on me from the crowd itself. They did not want me to walk away. They did not want quiet endurance. They wanted spectacle. They wanted to see what I would do, how I would respond, what power I could wield if I chose to strike back. Their hunger was palpable, their eyes gleaming with the thrill of watching two women wage war in a room where reputations were currency and image was everything. I could feel it in my bones. The night had tipped into something larger than humiliation, larger than rivalry. It had become theater, and I was no longer simply enduring it, I was being demanded to perform. The weight of that realization settled over me as I moved through the room, each step measured, each glance deliberate, and I felt the balance shifting, the tension coiling tighter, preparing for the inevitable breaking point. She, sensing her grip slipping, abandoned subtlety altogether. Her voice grew sharper, her jabs less disguised, her posture less graceful. At one point, she cornered me near the edge of the dance floor, her smile fixed but her eyes blazing, and she hissed through her teeth just loudly enough for those nearby to hear, "You think you've won something by standing there like a statue? You've won nothing. You don't belong here, you never will. And when this night is over, I'll make sure everyone remembers you not as a rival, but as a spectacle." The words were meant to cut deep, to pierce the armor of my composure, but instead they fueled the cold fire burning within me. I looked at her, really looked at her, the trembling hand barely steady on the stem of her glass, the twitch at the corner of her mouth, the flicker of desperation in eyes that had once only shown arrogance, and I saw it clearly. She was afraid. Afraid not of me, but of what she would become without me to measure herself against. Afraid of fading into irrelevance. Afraid of losing the only identity she had ever built. And in that moment, something within me hardened. This was no longer about surviving her cruelty. This was about ending it. I turned, my gown still stained, but my spine unbending, and I let my voice, calm and deliberate, carry into the air around us. The only thing anyone will remember tonight is that you mistook cruelty for strength, and it cost you everything. The words were simple, but they rippled through the crowd like a stone cast into still water, spreading outward, catching ears, drawing eyes. A hush fell once more, heavier than before, and in that hush I felt the balance shift entirely. She froze, caught between rage and disbelief, her smile faltering for the briefest second, and the crowd leaned closer, sensing that the theater had reached its turning point. The escalation reached its peak not with another glass tipped or another insult hurled, but with silence, the silence of a woman stripped of her audience, of her control, of the performance she had built so carefully. She tried to recover, tried to laugh it off, to raise her voice again, but the room no longer belonged to her. It belonged to me, not because I had shouted, not because I had retaliated with spectacle, but because I had refused to bend, refused to let her dictate the terms of our war. The crowd, restless and hungry, found their satisfaction not in blood spilled but in dignity preserved, in watching the woman who had staged humiliation stumble into it herself. I stood there, tall and unbroken, and I knew with absolute clarity that the night had turned. She had escalated, she had pressed, she had demanded, and in the end, she had given me everything I needed without me lifting a hand. Yet I also knew this was not the end. No, this was only the beginning of something darker, something more dangerous. Because she was not a woman who accepted defeat quietly. The look in her eyes as she turned away, as she forced her laughter through gritted teeth, told me what words could not. She would not forget this, and she would not forgive it. And so, even as the crowd drifted back into its rituals, even as the orchestra tried to recover its rhythm, even as the host fumbled through his speech to restore dignity to the evening, I felt the fire of what was yet to come burning at my back. The escalation had begun, but the war was far from over. The ballroom had shifted into a strange kind of theater, where every whispered word and every subtle glance seemed to vibrate with the same question, what would I do next? For so long I had endured her slights in silence, had allowed her venom to run unchecked through our circles, had chosen composure over confrontation, but the tide of the evening had turned, and I could feel the weight of expectation pressing on me from all sides. Guests lingered in clusters, their conversations only half-formed, their eyes flicking constantly between the two of us, drawn like moths to the glow of conflict. The orchestra played on, but their notes felt thin, uncertain background noise to a drama no one wanted to miss. She had spilled her wine, she had pressed her insults, she had staged her scene, but now her laughter rang brittle, her jabs landed dull, her audience slipping through her fingers. And I still drenched in crimson stain. My ruined gown heavy with humiliation stood in the center of it all like an unburnt flame, silent yet unyielding. The realization settled cold in my chest. She had demanded spectacle, but spectacle did not have to mean her victory. It could mean mine. All it required was the courage to strike, not with clumsy cruelty as she had, but with precision, with words and revelations that would leave scars she could never cover with silk or jewels. I took a step forward, slow and deliberate, my heels clicking against marble with a rhythm that cut through the chatter, and conversation stilled as though pulled by invisible thread. I approached her where she stood, glass in hand, smile painted too wide, her eyes glinting with the desperate defiance of someone who felt the ground tilting beneath her feet. When I stopped before her, I let the silence linger just long enough to become unbearable, long enough for every guest within earshot to lean closer, and then I spoke, my voice low but carrying, sharpened into steel. "You call this an accident," I said, my gaze locking hers. "But accidents don't come with rehearsed apologies or laughter rehearsed for the crowd. This wasn't clumsiness. This was cruelty." A ripple passed through the room, a wave of murmurs breaking against marble and crystal, and her smile faltered even as she tried to recover. "How dare you suggest," she began, but I did not let her finish. I raised my voice, just enough to command the room, and let the truth spill with the same precision she had once weaponized against me. "Do you think they don't see you? Do you think they haven't noticed the way you cling to scandal because it's the only stage left to you? Do you think they don't hear the whispers you spread, the lies you plant, the way you survive only by cutting others down?" Each word struck like a blow, not shouted, not hysterical, but delivered with such clarity that it rang undeniable. The crowd stiffened, eyes widening, heads turning toward her with expressions that betrayed both shock and recognition. Because the truth, once spoken, does not need proof, it only needs air to breathe. Her hand tightened around her glass, knuckles whitening, her smile cracking at the edges. For the first time, she seemed small, diminished beneath the weight of her own theater, and I pressed the blade further. "You wanted to humiliate me," I said, calm and deliberate, "but all you've done is reveal yourself. And when tonight is remembered, it won't be the stain on my gown they speak of. It will be the stain on your name." The silence that followed was heavier than any silence before, thick with shock, curiosity, and something else, admiration. Guests who had lingered on the fence, waiting to see who would fall, began to tilt, their expressions shifting, their whispers softening into agreement. She, desperate now, tried to laugh, a sound high and brittle, and raised her glass once more as though to toast her way out of defeat. "My, what a dramatization," she sneered. Though her voice trembled, "Perhaps you should be the one on stage." But the performance was dead. Her charm had rotted into desperation, and the room no longer moved with her. It moved with me. I let the silence breathe again before delivering the final cut. My words quiet but slicing clean through the air. "I don't need a stage. I only need the truth." And with that, I turned away, not rushing, not trembling, but gliding through the room with the ruin of my gown trailing behind me like armor, leaving her frozen in place, her glass trembling, her smile shattered. The effect was seismic. Conversations erupted in hushed tones. The orchestra faltered and then swelled again as though to mark the shift, and I felt the current of the evening change direction entirely. For so long she had held the power, commanding attention with spectacle. But now she was only spectacle herself, stripped of command, reduced to a figure of pity and ridicule. I could feel her eyes burning into my back, sharp with hatred, but it no longer mattered. The crowd had chosen, and they had chosen me. Yet, even as the weight lifted from my chest, even as the whispers turned in my favor, I knew this was not over. Because women like her do not accept defeat? They plot, they scheme, they wait. And the look she gave me as I walked away told me what words could not. She would come for me again. And the war she had unleashed tonight was only beginning. Still, for that moment, beneath the glittering chandeliers and the watchful eyes of the world, I had turned humiliation into triumph, and it was her, not me, who would leave the ballroom in ruins. The gala did not return to what it had been before. Because nights like these are not capable of rewinding once the veil has been ripped. Instead, it settled into something jagged, a parody of elegance where every laugh sounded forced, every toast brittle, every movement weighed down by the memory of what had just unfolded. I could feel it in the way the orchestra resumed, their bows dragging heavy across strings, notes stretched too thin, trembling as though afraid to pierce the silence too boldly. The host, poor man, tried valiantly to recover, lifting his glass with a smile plastered so tightly it looked carved into his face. But even his words stumbled, his welcome speech drowned beneath the hum of whispers that would not die. Guests sipped their champagne, but their eyes were restless, flicking always between her and me, their curiosity not yet sated, their hunger for drama insatiable. And she, once the queen of every room she entered, now stood isolated, her circle of admirers shrinking, their smiles faltering when she approached, their polite laughter drying to dust. She had tried to recover with sarcasm, with brittle jokes, with the too loud laugh of someone pretending the dagger hadn't cut, but it was too late. Her mask had cracked, her cruelty laid bare, and the world had seen. I moved through the room not as a victor flaunting triumph, but as someone who carried dignity like a shield, speaking softly, thanking those who offered sympathy, smiling at those who whispered support, but never crowing, never pushing. It was the restraint, I think, that cemented the moment. Where she had grasped at attention with clawed fingers, I allowed it to fall to me like gravity, inevitable and effortless. And so the shift spread, whisper to whisper, until the crowd's loyalty tilted firmly in my favor. Yet beneath the glow of approval, I felt something darker stirring. Every glance I caught from her was sharper, hotter, more dangerous than before, and I knew that while she had lost the crowd, she had not surrendered the war. There was a fury building inside her that no ballroom humiliation could extinguish, a hunger for revenge that would not be satisfied with one night's defeat. Still, as the gala dragged itself toward its conclusion, I let myself breathe in the satisfaction of the turn. She had meant to destroy me, to drown me in spectacle, but I had walked through her fire and emerged unscathed, and the sight of her trembling hands, her brittle smile, was proof enough that she, not I, would carry the scars of the evening. But the resolution of that night was not confined to glances and whispers. It unfolded in the subtle, but irreversible, shifts of power that such spectacles always create. By the time the orchestra struck its final notes and the crowd began to disperse into the cool night air, the story had already been written into the fabric of our circle. I could hear it in fragments as I drifted past clusters of guests. Did you see her composure? Imagine being laughed at like that. She ruined her own reputation. These murmurs followed me like shadows, soft but steady, weaving into a narrative that would survive long after the chandeliers dimmed. She tried, of course, to salvage what she could, lingering at the edges of conversations, dropping barbed remarks disguised as wit, but the tide had turned and she could not push it back. Even those who had once clung to her glitter recoiled now, unwilling to tie themselves to a sinking ship. I felt the shift most keenly when men and women who had previously dismissed me as background began to seek me out, their smiles warmer, their words heavier with respect. They wanted to align themselves with strength, with dignity, with the person who had endured cruelty without shattering. And so, as she slipped quietly toward the exit, her scarlet gown now less a symbol of allure and more a mark of desperation, I knew that her fall had begun. Yet the victory was not sweet in the way I imagined. It was sharp, edged with the knowledge that nothing is ever truly over. For every whisper in my favor, there would be one in the shadows against me. For every ally gained, an enemy would sharpen her blade. And as I stood at the grand staircase one final time, watching the crowd trickle out into the night, I understood with a chill that the resolution of the gala was not an ending, but a beginning. She had struck with wine, I had struck with truth, but wars are not won in a single night. They are fought in the days and months that follow, in the whispers that spread, in the choices that wound deeper than any spilled glass. And so, beneath the flicker of the dying chandeliers, I promised myself that I would be ready for what came next. Because she would come, and when she did, I would not only meet her, I would finish what she had started. Thank you for staying till the end of this story. If you enjoyed it, make sure to subscribe to Fractured Promises. It's free, and it gives me the motivation to bring you even more powerful stories. Don't forget to like this video and share your thoughts in the comments.